Let's all turn to 1 Kings chapter 16. We're going to read about the spiritual state of Israel at this time. This is obviously after the kingdom has split, David and Solomon. Now the kingdom has split and some years have passed, and Israel, they never had a righteous king, but they have fallen into particularly unrighteous ways. 1 Kings chapter 16 tells us about King Omri, who was, I think, the sixth king after the split. So verse 25 tells us this about Omri. Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord and acted more wickedly than all who were before him. For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sins which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their idols. So that was Omri. And then soon after that, Omri was succeeded by his son Ahab. And in verse 29 it tells us, now Ahab the son of Omri became king over Israel in the 38th year of Asa king of Judah. And verse 30 says, Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. It came about as though it were a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. So he erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So first we read Omri, who is said to have done more evil than all who were before him. And then his successor is even worse. He does even more worse than what Omri did. So what we have here is a situation in Israel where they are the absolute pits of unrighteousness. And we all know, of course, Ahab, King Ahab, and the things that happened in his time. Now, during this time is when God raised up the prophet Elijah. And that is going to be the subject of today's sermon, the prophet Elijah, bearing in mind the context of what we see at Israel at this point in time. Now, Elijah can probably be said to be one of the greatest prophets in all history. Maybe the greatest, certainly one of the greatest. How can we say this? How can we know this about Elijah? Firstly, recall that he is one of only two men recorded to have never died. We know Enoch in Genesis. It tells us that Enoch walked with God and then he was not, for God took him. God honoured Elijah in the same way. We can turn to 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 11, and it says, as they, Elijah and his successor Elisha, as they were going along and talking, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire which separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. So Elijah is accorded this special honour, which is only recorded, the only two people in the whole world who have been taken up in this manner, Enoch and Elijah. So he is clearly someone precious in God's sight. What else do we know about Elijah? In Matthew 17, during the transfiguration of Jesus, we have Peter and James and John observing Jesus speaking with who? It was Moses and Elijah. So Elijah was called upon at that point in time by God to be there as this more than a teaching moment, certainly, but it certainly was a teaching moment for those three disciples, that Elijah was now superseded by Jesus. And then, of course, we know also that Elijah left a huge imprint on the minds of the Jewish people. When Jesus asked his disciples, what do the people say that I am? What did his disciples say? Some say that you are Elijah, risen from the dead. So he was still fresh in their memories. The greatness of Elijah had not been forgotten about. And they probably were thinking back to what we read about in Malachi 4:5. Right at the end of the book of Malachi, we have that prophecy that when God says, behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. So those Jews would have had that in mind. They knew that there was this promise that Elijah was coming again. obviously not in a literal sense, but that was the prophecy that they were thinking about when Jesus asked them that question. So Elijah, undoubtedly one of the greatest prophets in history. Now we're going to have an overview of his ministry here. You can find Elijah's ministry mostly recorded in 1 Kings towards the end, chapter 17, 18 and 19. There's also a little bit later with Naboth's vineyard, a few chapters after that. And then at the beginning of the book of 2 Kings is when he does a few more bits and pieces, and then he is taken up by a whirlwind into heaven, as we read before. But most of it, what we're going to be talking about today, is in 1 Kings chapter 17, 18 and 19. So, in summary, if you are not that familiar with Elijah's life, the first thing that we read about with Elijah is him predicting a drought that was going to occur in the land of Israel before the king Ahab. And then he goes into hiding away from Ahab, and there is this drought that takes place for 3.5 years. And remember the woman of Zarephath that occurred during that time, the woman of Zarephath, the two things that occurred there, we'll read about this later, but I'm just giving you an overview, is that she had the bowl of flour and oil that never ran dry during this famine, and then her son died, and Elijah brought him back from the dead. And then we have, of course, the famous contest on Mount Carmel between the prophets of Baal and Elijah that occurred after that, where they had that contest on the mountaintop. And then, of course, we have Elijah's flight from Jezebel to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. And then sometime after that, we have the case of Naboth's vineyard, which I'm not going to go into today. But Naboth's vineyard is when Ahab took unrighteously Naboth's vineyard, and Elijah confronted him about that. And then in 2 Kings chapter 1, we have the case of Ahab's successor. The next king in line was Ahaziah, and Elijah confronts that king also. And then finally in chapter 2 of 2 Kings is when he's taken up by a whirlwind into heaven. So we have about 5 or so chapters in the whole Bible which really deal with Elijah's life. Now, Elijah, we already went through why he was a special prophet, but if we look at the miracles that he performed, we can also see example here of why he was a particularly exceptional and important prophet. He performed miracles the likes of which I don't believe had ever been seen in the Old Testament. Firstly, 1 Kings 17 verse 1. This is when Elijah is introduced to the stage. It says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, 'As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall neither be dew nor rain these years, except by my word.'" So that was Elijah's prophecy to Ahab. Now, we actually have a little bit more information than that. In the New Testament, this is when it starts in the Old Testament, but if we turn to James chapter 5, verse 17, James tells us this about Elijah. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. This happened before Elijah approached Ahab, didn't it? He prayed about it first, and it tells us he prayed earnestly. So, when we read about Elijah in 1 Kings 17, remember, James is also telling us something that the Old Testament people would not necessarily have known about, that he had prayed about it beforehand. And it wasn't as though Elijah was praying for this thing out of a desire to harm the people of Israel because he hated them. It's because he loved them. God had told the people that if they turn away from him, that famine would be one of the punishments. And all Elijah is doing is following through with that. He's saying, well, the people have turned away. They are more wicked than ever before. This has to be addressed. And so he's prayed about it. Famine is what happens as a result of Elijah's prayer. Drought and famine. So that was Elijah's first great miracle. Back to 1 Kings 17. In fact, probably put your bookmarks in there because we're going to spend the morning in that chapter and around it. As a result of this famine, Ahab goes into hiding. Ahab. Elijah goes into hiding, and during that period of hiding, he stays with this woman of Zarephath. In verse 14, it says he's living with this woman, and she and her son are about to die of starvation. He asks her for some food, and she complies with his request, despite the fact that she is on her their last food. Basically, they're about to run out. But Elijah saves them from this fate, and says in verse 14, "For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor shall the jar of oil be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain on the face of the earth." So she went and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke through Elijah. That's the second miracle that we have recorded there, performed by Elijah, that we have this unending supply of flour and oil. And then immediately after that, we have the next account of what occurs. The son that this woman has suffers an illness, and he actually dies. And the result was that in verse 19, Elijah says to the woman, "Give me your son." And then it says he took him from her bosom and carried her to the upper room where he was living and laid him on his own bed. He called to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, have you also brought calamity to the widow with whom I was staying by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and called to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, I pray you, let this child's life return to him." The Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child returned to him, and he revived. That's the third miracle that we see performed by Elijah, and it's a great one, in fact, because it's the first instance of resurrection that you read about in the whole Bible. Think about it, that Elijah had no prior example to follow. He asked for this thing not knowing that God could do it, maybe, that he would do it. He had no example to follow, but he's gone and prayed for it nonetheless, without any previous examples, and his prayer has been answered. In chapter 18 of 1 Kings, we have the case of the contest on Mount Carmel. I don't want to read the whole contest because I'm sure we're familiar with it, but just to summarise, they've had drought for 3.5 years. Baal, who is apparently supposed to be the god of storm and rain, hasn't been able to address this drought, and so they have this contest on the top of the Mount Carmel with 450 prophets of Baal against one prophet of God, Jehovah. And of course, the prophets of Baal are dancing around the altar all day long, cutting themselves and making all sorts of incantations, and nothing happens. And Elijah mocks them. In verse 27, it says, "It came about noon that Elijah mocked them and said, 'Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened.'" So Elijah is mocking them in their foolish efforts to try and bring about this miracle from the false god Baal. And it says, "So they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out on them." So obviously that fails. And then eventually the people have probably had enough. They've been sitting there all day in the hot sun, waiting for something to happen. Nothing's happened. And so Elijah's turn comes up. And in verse 32, Elijah, it says he rebuilds an altar in the name of the Lord. So there used to be an altar at this place, which had been destroyed, presumably by Jezebel and the prophets of Baal. And it says, he said in verse 34, "Fill 4 pitchers with water and pour on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. Think about that they're in the middle of a drought here. Presumably there's no water on top of Mount Carmel. They would have probably lugged it up the mountainside in pitchers or jars or something like that. And he's just gone and told them to tip it all out on this altar in the middle of a drought. I think that there must have already been some element of, it's either faith or just absolute sheer desperation on the part of these people, that perhaps they think maybe we just do what Elijah says, this drought will be fixed. Or maybe they're thinking, what else do we have to lose at this point? I don't know how you want to take that, but they did what he instructed them to do. And I don't know if it means anything, but in In the previous verses, it tells us that there were 12 stones that Elijah used to reconstruct the altar, and now we have 4 pitchers being poured out 3 times. So you have 12 pourings of water on the altar as well. So obviously representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we know in verse 36, at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah prays to God. It says, O God, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again. And then we know the outcome, that fire fell from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water in the trench. And the result of all this is that the people actually repented, albeit we know for a short time Israel never really came back, but it says that they repented, or we can see that they repented in verse 39. When the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And then they put these words into action, and at Elijah's instruction, they seized the prophets of Baal, all 450 of them, and they slew the whole lot. And at this point is when the drought comes to an end. Verse 41, Elijah said to Ahab, Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a roar of a heavy shower. So it hasn't come yet, but it's coming, Elijah said. The drought after 3.5 years is over. Now notice that it's only after Elijah makes this declaration to Ahab that he prays about it. He makes the declaration to Ahab first. He says the drought's ended. And then in verse 42 it says, So Ahab went up to eat and drink, but Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel, and he crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And reading on, it says, he said to his servant, Go up now, look towards the sea. And so the servant went up and said, There is nothing. And he said, Go back 7 times. So the servant has gone back and forth 7 times to look towards the sea to see if any rain is on the way. And verse 44, it came about the 7th time that he said, Behold, a cloud as small as a man's hand is coming up from the sea. And he said, Go up, say to Ahab, Prepare your chariot and go down, so that the heavy shower does not stop you. In a little while the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. So that's the 4th miracle, isn't it? We have the drought, we have the jar of oil and flour, we have the resurrection of the boy, and then we have the ending. So we have the fire from heaven, and then we have the ending of the drought. God, remember, it's been 3.5 years. They haven't had any rain, and Elijah has now brought about the end of that drought with not just a trickle of water, but a heavy shower. The last miracle that we see recorded from Elijah is actually in the book of 2 Kings chapter 1. This must have been some years later. I will cover it just because it's another great miracle that Elijah performed, but everything we read about has occurred in a 3.5 year period. This Ahab has died. His successor Ahaziah has come into power, and Ahaziah has fallen through a ladder, as it tells us at the beginning of the book, and he's injured himself. And he goes and sends his people to go and inquire of Baal about whether or not he will recover. After all that's happened, he goes and asks Baal, Will I recover from this illness? And so Elijah, you can read the full story, but he intervenes and says, well, because you haven't inquired of God, you are going to die of this illness. And Ahaziah is not happy with this, and so he sends his henchmen to go and bring Elijah before him, imprison him, torture him, kill him. And so what happens is Elijah calls down fire from heaven again. In verse 9 of 2 Kings chapter 1, it says, Then the king sent to him a captain of 50 with his 50, and he went up to him, and behold, he was sitting on the top of a hill. And he said to him, O man of God, the king says, Come down. Elijah replied to the captain of 50, If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. And then fire came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. So he again sent to him another captain of 50 with his 50, and he said to him, O man of God, thus says the king, come down quickly. Elijah replied to them, If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. Then the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed him and his 50. So he again sent the captain of a third 50 with his 50. When the third captain of 50 went up, he came and bowed down on his knees before Elijah and begged him and said to him, O man of God, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight. Behold, fire came down from heaven and consumed the first two captains of 50 with their 50s, but now let my life be precious in your sight. So the angel of the Lord said to Elijah, Go down with him and do not be afraid of him. And so he arose and went down with him to the king. So there are the other the final miracles that we see, main miracles that we see Elijah performing. He calls down fire from heaven on 3 occasions then, doesn't he? Firstly on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal, and then it happens twice here with these captains of the 50. He does perform one more miracle after that, which is where he parts the Jordan before he is taken up into heaven, but I didn't want to get into that one today as well. But in summary, Elijah has performed a wide array of different types of miracles during his ministry. He's brought about drought, and he's ended a drought. He's resurrected a boy to life, the first instance of resurrection that we see in the Bible, and he's called down fire from heaven on 3 separate occasions. Now, we shouldn't miss the theme running through most of these examples here, which is Elijah's dedication to prayer. It tells us, James, we read it earlier, right? James 5:16 tells us that Elijah prayed earnestly that it would not rain. So we take it to mean that it wasn't just a off-the-cuff prayer that Elijah uttered, but it was a repeated and earnest prayer to God that he would do this thing. In 1 Kings 17:21, where he resurrected the boy, what does it say exactly? 1 Kings 17:21, Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and called to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray you, let this child's life return to him. Now, the way I understand that is he didn't just stretch himself on the child 3 times and then pray, but I think each time he stretched himself across the child, he prayed this prayer. I think he prayed 3 times in that occasion to God that he would bring him back from the dead. So 3 times he prayed about this matter is how I take that. And then, of course, with the contest on Mount Carmel, we read about that prayer that Elijah gave. It was only once in verses 36 and 37. 37 says, Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that the people may know you. So he does that prayer only once at that time. I think obviously now is not the time for God to test Elijah's faith. They want an immediate response that demonstrates God's power. But then on verse 42, when Elijah prays for the end of the drought, he prayed 7 times. We have to take it that he prayed 7 times. In verse 42 it says, Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel and he crouched down on the earth and put his face between his knees. What was Elijah doing when he put his face between his knees? It's not maybe 100% clear in this passage, but we know that he was praying because we can read about it in James 5:18. We read James 5:16 and 17 earlier. James 5:18 tells us that then he, Elijah, prayed again, and the sky poured rain and the earth produced its fruit. So Elijah prayed again at this point in time when he was on top of the mountain that it would rain again. And I think he prayed 7 times that it would rain. And on the 7th prayer, God answered it, and that's when the drought was ended. So we have to take note here that Elijah's prayer life was very dedicated, and that it was also repetitious. We have to remember also that he had no examples of the things that he was praying for. He had no examples of people coming back from the dead or fire coming down from heaven. We also have to remember that the things he's asking for is not something that's been directed by God exactly. Think about maybe someone before him who performed great miracles. Moses is probably the one that comes to mind. But if you read about Moses' miracles, he is always operating under the direct instruction of God. When he parted the Red Sea. It was because God told him to raise your staff and the sea would be parted. So God actually told him to do that. Whereas Elijah is actually operating on his own initiative when he asks for all these things. As far as we can see, God has not told him to ask, to pray about the boy coming back, or God didn't tell him to go and arrange a contest on Mount Carmel. He's gone and done all these things on his own faith and his own initiative. And so in James 5:16, when James tells us that the effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much, this is why I think James uses Elijah as the example, because there's no other example of anyone who had such a dedicated and faithful prayer life, and he was so persistent about it. Now, having considered this, the greatness of Elijah's prayer life, we also have to consider that Elijah was still a man. That's what James says. He was a man with a nature like ours. And we can read about a weakness in Elijah's character through these few chapters in the book of 1 Kings. So, what was his weakness? He's just had this great success on Mount Carmel. Presumably, Elijah would have been exuberant. He's had a few hours, he's had a whole day mocking the prophets of Baal, and then this great finale with fire coming down from heaven and the prophets being slain, and then a great storm and downpour that follows to end this drought. Think about that 24-hour period in Elijah's life and how exhilarating it would have been for him. But what follows immediately after that is proof that none of us can consider the race to have been completed until we're called back to heaven. What happens after that? We can read about it in 1 Kings 19, First Kings 19, verse 1. The contest is completed. They've gone back to the city of Jezreel, Ahab and Elijah both. And it says in verse 1, "Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword." Remember, these Baal prophets are Jezebel's doing. They are directly under her control. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." So he's received threats from the queen. What does he do? It says in verse 3, he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. And then he goes even further. In verse 4, he went by himself, so he left his servant behind, and he went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers." So how can it be that after acting with so much courage and power on Mount Carmel, literally one day, maybe 2 days later, he's gone and fled from Jezebel, who has, what did she say? "So may the gods do to me." What gods? She's talking about Baal, who just lost a contest. What's he got to be afraid of? And yet that's exactly what he does. He gets up and he flees from Jezebel. And not even that, but he asked God to take his life. How bad is it was it really that bad, Elijah, that you had to ask God to take your life after everything that's happened? But thankfully, God does not answer that prayer of his. What happens? Elijah continues to flee. He actually leaves Israel and Judah altogether and goes down into the wilderness of Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb. It's the same mountain that's referred to here. In verse 19 of chapter 19, verse 9, it tells us that Elijah came to a cave on the mountain, and he lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here?" What is he doing there? He's in the wilderness. There's not going to be anybody there. It's going to be a deserted mountain, holy to the Lord. He's far away from Jezebel and Ahab. There's no danger. He's also far away from the people of Israel, who has just proven to who the real God is. He's just proven them the power of God. What is he doing there for on Mount Sinai? And I think Elijah my reading of this is that he knows he can't really make a justifiable answer here. Just like when God asks Eve, what did you do? Or what did you do, Adam? They blamed someone else. They cannot find a justifiable excuse. What does Elijah say? He says, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. This is his excuse, that basically, I've been righteous, but it's all too hard. There's no one left but me, and it's a pointless exercise, what I've been trying to do here. That's his answer to God. What are you doing here? Your ministry is in Israel, the people of Israel. What are you doing out here on Mount Sinai? And of course, Elijah cannot make a proper response to that question. What does God do? He doesn't throw Elijah away and say, okay, it's over then if you don't want to do this anymore. He actually gives him a series of signs. We read about these in verses 11 and 12. It says, so he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. Now, before I get into this part, let's look at that last bit there about a gentle blowing, because I'm reading from the New American Standard here. And I've gone and looked up what that phrase really means. If you go digging through all the other translations, they all come up with something along the lines of, instead of gentle blowing, they have a still small voice, or a gentle whisper, or the soft whisper of a voice. So when it says gentle blowing, it doesn't, you might think it's just a normal breeze, but if you look at the other translations, and even Strong's Concordance, if you look at the literal meaning of the words used there in the Hebrew, still, it gives the idea of a still but quiet whispering voice or sound. It's not just a wind, and the other translations I think pick that up better, that there is a sound of a gentle whispering, or a gentle voice in the wind is what the idea is. So God gives these three great signs: a powerful wind that is so strong that it rips rocks off the mountainsides, and then there is a great earthquake that shook the mountain, and then there is a great fire. It doesn't tell us what this fire is, but obviously it's of similar magnificence to the previous two things that he's just done, but it tells us each time that God is not in any of those things. But then there is a sound of a gentle voice, and it doesn't say it, but clearly the implication is that that's where God is. He's in that gentle voice, in that quiet whisper. So what is God's meaning here in showing Elijah these signs? God is clearly showing Elijah that he has the power to do great things. He is able to rip mountains apart by wind, or create earthquakes at will, just as he showed them on Mount Carmel. But if Elijah had any doubt that God couldn't protect him from Jezebel, then he should not have any such doubts. Just as God rained fire from heaven on Mount Carmel, in the same way he is able to do these things that we've just read about. But God is rather showing him that these mighty and magnificent things is not really the way that God wants to work. That's not the way that God operates in this world. Remember that Elijah has just had this huge contest on Mount Carmel with a great success, and it's got all of the bells and whistles and the fireworks and fanfare. All that has happened, and Elijah is thinking, this is how we win the battle against unrighteousness, through great works and great sensational things like that. But that's not what God is saying here. That's not how we do things. In the following verses, verse 13, God asks him the same question again. Elijah goes out onto the mountainside and God says to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah gives the same response in verse 14. He said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Now, God basically ignores this excuse and gives Elijah direction. God says in verse 15, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, he gives him 3 things to do. You shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place." So 3 things: to anoint 2 kings and his own successor, who was going to be Elisha. Now, you can read that Elisha was the one who actually went and anointed those kings, but I think here we see what is meant by that quiet and still voice. That the operation of those kings being anointed and Elisha being Elijah's successor, if you read about that, you see how that impacts world events later on. How God brings about his punishments and his justice through these people. Not through great miracles from the sky, but rather through small things that have large consequences later on. And secondly, so he gives him that direction. And secondly, he corrects Elijah's misconception that he is the only remaining righteous person in Israel. Verse 18, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him," which is what Paul quotes in Romans. So for a start, Elijah is wrong anyway when he says he is the only one righteous left in Israel. There are still 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So I said before that we have this weakness in Elijah's character. Yes, he had a great prayer life. He had a man of great faith. But we can see in here there is an instability. And that is that I think he seems to have been a rather emotional type of person, prone to great exuberance and then followed by melancholy. He's an all or nothing type of guy. He would have been so happy. He was so happy to mock the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and then go tell Ahab the drought is over before he'd even prayed about it. He would have been full of exuberance. He would have been full of power and faith at that moment in time. But then just a couple of days later, he receives a threat from Jezebel and he flees for his life. And not only does he flee for his life, but he complains, he says to God, "Take my life. I might as well just die. It's all hopeless. It's all pointless. Just take me now, God." He's just in the pits of despair so quickly and so easily. And then when he's on Mount Sinai, God asks, "What are you doing here?" He just complains and says, "Oh, well, I'm the only righteous person left. I've done this great miracle on Mount Carmel and it's basically been all for nothing. So it's all too hard." So that seems to me that we can glean that about Elijah's character. Of course, I would never want to denigrate his character. He is a great man, undoubtedly. But it says in James, he was a man with a nature like ours. And we all are different types of characters ourselves in the church, in Christ's body, just like Elijah was. He seems to have got it into his head that God only works through these sensational miracles, that it's through raising the dead or fire from heaven, that this is how God works. This is the way God gets things done. But God corrects him and says, no, it's the quiet and still voice that gets the job done. Elijah reminds me of Peter in a lot of ways. When Peter confessed that Jesus is the Christ, and Jesus said that you are the rock on which the church shall be built. But only shortly after that, Peter is rebuked by Jesus and Jesus calls him Satan. It's exactly the same, where we have this great success by Elijah and then a great fall when he flees Jezebel. It's the same thing for Peter. Peter is a similar character. I think we can see that when Peter called on Jesus to let him walk on the water, he would have been filled with great faith and exuberance for those few moments when he was on the water, but then he became fearful and he began to sink. Or after Jesus had been resurrected, if you read it, I think it's at the end of the end of John, I think. They're on the boat in Galilee and they see Jesus on the shore. And while the other disciples row the boat back, he jumps in the water and swims off to Jesus. That's the kind of character Peter is. And I think it's similar to Elijah's. So the conclusion then is that people come in all types, don't they? Some are like Elijah and like Peter, who are more, I don't know, I'm not going to say unstable, but up and down types. And other people are flat. They don't waver, they don't change, depending on the circumstances around them. But as it tells us, Paul tells us that some are given as pastors and some as teachers and some as evangelists. Everybody is part of the body of Christ and we all have our own roles. Elijah certainly teaches us, he should teach us about the importance of prayer. Jesus gave that parable in Luke 18 verse 1 about the persistence of prayer. In Luke 18 verse 1 it says, "Now he was telling them a parable to show them at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, In a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. There was a widow in that city, and she kept coming to him saying, Give me legal protection from my opponent. For a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, Even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming to me, she will wear me out." So that's an unrighteous man who has no fear of God and has no care for man. If persistent requests can work on a man like that, then certainly persistent requests can work on God. And we should always bear that in mind, that Elijah prayed earnestly that it would not rain. He prayed 3 times over the dead boy. He prayed 7 times that the drought would come to an end. And God answers him at the end. And he teaches us that we are all human. We all stumble. We all sin. Elijah, I think he sinned. It was a lack of faith when he fled Jezebel. He shouldn't have done that. That was a sin. But we all sin. We all stumble in our faith. And what do? We know, we read Simon the sorcerer was told to confess and repent his sins. And we do the same. Elijah also teaches us that sometimes we feel like we're so alone in the world as Christians, as followers of God. The congregation seems so small that we have to remember that God knows who are his. He knows that just as there were 7,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal, just like today, there will be more that have not bowed the knee to Satan, the knee to the false idols of this world. Just because we don't know we're there doesn't mean they're not there. And the life of a Christian is not about big sensational miracles. It's not about calling fire down from heaven. That doesn't get the job done, despite what many people think. So many people today's focus is on miracles and great events. They want to talk about the end of the world and what's happening in the Book of Revelation and things like that. That's not what it's about. It's about that still and quiet voice, which is the diligent and quiet work of the people of God in the world. It's like what Jesus said, that each of us must take up our cross daily and follow him. This is what brings about salvation to people. It's not the great miracles, but it's our diligent and consistent efforts in the world. That's what we can learn from Elijah. Thank you.